Thank you for joining me on this trip through one of the scariest cases in history. Today, we're going to talk about some scary things that happened in a small town in the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky. These are still talked about today because the Misty Mountains still hold ancient secrets. But first, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Let's work together to make this community better. It is not true that this movie was made. It was just made for fun. Any resemblance to real people, alive or dead, is just a coincidence. When 1901 came around, the mountainous parts of Kentucky had a strange feeling. At that time, the Appalachian communities were pretty cut off from the rest of the country. The only way to get to them was along narrow trails that wound around mountains that were always foggy. Families had been related for many generations, shared stories around hearths, and kept up traditions that went back to the beginning of time. Life moved slowly because of the seasons and the work that needed to be done on the land. It was Margaret Ward. Everyone in Harlan County knows them. She had come to that area from somewhere no one knew for sure years before. A few people said she was from Virginia. Some people said they were sure she was from the lowlands of North Carolina. Margaret never said that these stories were true or false. She liked being alone in the thick forests and hearing the sounds of waterfalls that not many people knew about. It was just her and a wooden cabin on the highest slopes. Some days the fog was so thick that it seemed to cover the whole mountain. Take everything in. People in the area always thought Margaret was different. She knew a lot about the medicinal herbs, roots, and plants that grew in the damp, shady forest. When someone got sick, people would often go find her. It was said that the ointments, dark teas, and picuses she made could heal wounds that regular doctors couldn't. But this gift had a bad name attached to it. There were people who really respected her, and there were also people who said words of doubt as she walked by. Something changed in the fall of 1901. Margaret was seen in the nearby villages less and less often. Her trips to trade medicine for food stopped happening very often. Some hikers on the higher trails said they saw strange lights near her cabin at night. They said they saw a pale glow that moved through the trees like it had its own life. Others said they heard melodies and songs in languages they didn't know. These claims made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. It was a cold November morning when things started to go wrong. Thomas Brennan was a hunter who was following deer tracks when he saw something that made him run away right away. He found personal items like torn clothes, bloody pieces of fabric, and things that clearly belonged to someone on the ground near a stream that came down from the mountains. The most disturbing thing was the writing that was carved into the trees nearby. The writing was deep and made patterns in the bark that were impossible to understand. Thomas rushed to the closest village and told the sheriff there, a man named William Oakes, about what he had found. The sheriff and some volunteers went to the place that was pointed out. What they found was also very scary. The things looked like they were left there on purpose, set up in a way that was almost ritualistic. Even though there were no signs of a fight, the amount of blood on the clothes made it look like there had been a fight. Margaret Ward was the first person who was thought to be guilty. Her cabin was not far from that place. The door was open and swaying in the wind when the sheriff and his men got there. From the inside, it looked like everyone had left. Pots still had food left over in them. There was a strong smell everywhere because the candles were melting all the way to the bottom. She wasn't there, though. She was no longer seen or heard from. After that, there was a huge search going on for several days. Trackers with a lot of experience were called in from counties nearby. They searched every path, cave, and open space in the heights. They found more symbols carved into trees. The patterns were always round. On some trees they found small things hanging from the branches, stones tied together with hair, animal bones arranged in geometric shapes, and glass vials with dark liquids inside that no one was brave enough to open. The community started to get scared. From the deepest memories, old stories about occult practices came back to life. Older people told stories about dark deals people made in the mountains with people who wanted powers beyond human to understand. Margaret Ward was once feared because she might have crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed. She was once sought after for her healing powers. That year, winter came early and covered the mountains in thick snow. The search was stopped. Kate Ward was never found. The things that were found near the creek were still not identified. No one ever claimed those things or came looking for people who were missing. Everything looked like it came out of thin air. A mystery that was left there on purpose to haunt those who... I found it. The next few months were filled with unease that hung around like the fog in the Appalachians. At night, everyone locked their doors, even people who had never been worried about it before. There was a lot of mistrust in Harlan County, which used to be a place where people were friendly and trustworthy. People talked about the same thing in general stores, but they whispered it so no one else could hear. During the winter, Margaret's cabin was left empty. No one was brave. Go about it. Even animals avoided the area, they said. The birds didn't perch in the nearby trees, and the deer didn't go to their usual routes. Sheriff William Oakes sometimes kept an eye on the area, but only a few people knew that every time he climbed up there, he felt an unsettling presence. It seemed like the mountains might have secrets they didn't want to share. When the snow finally melted in the spring of 1902, and the streams started to flow full force again, new things happened. Things started to happen. A traveling salesman who worked the trade routes along the Appalachians showed up in the town of Cumberland in the far eastern part of Kentucky with a scary tale. He swore that he had met a woman on his journey who was exactly like Margaret Ward described her. He said she was at a remote fork in the road, sitting on a rock and looking out at the horizon as if she were waiting for someone. It was said that the vendor tried to talk to her, but Margaret just stared at him blankly. Before he could get close, it vanished into the trees. When he got to the spot where she had been, there were no footprints or other signs of anyone having been there. There was only a bitter cold that hurt his bones, even though it was afternoon. Many people didn't believe this story at first, thinking it might have been made up by tiredness from long trips or heavy drinking, but then other people started to report seeing the same things. A woman who looked a lot like the woman in the picture was seen walking along the banks of the Cumberland River in the middle of the night. A farmer who gets home late said she saw the shape of a woman standing in the middle of the road and watching his cart come up. The figure just disappeared into the darkness when he stopped to offer help. Over the course of several months, these reports kept coming in, always about the same things and always with the same result. The ghostly figure disappeared before anyone could make real contact with it. Sheriff Oakes chose to look into these reports himself. He went to Cumberland and talked to the traveling salesman, writing down everything he said. Story. Then he walked the trails that were mentioned in the other sightings, looking for proof. What he found was interesting. In some of the places where Margaret was said to have been seen, he found the same symbols carved into the trees near her cabin. These marks were new-made days or even hours before. This pointed to two equally scary possibilities. In the mountains, Margaret Ward seemed to be moving almost like a ghost. Either she was really alive or someone was trying to trick her. They were thinking about making a big lie to keep the legend alive, but the sheriff couldn't decide which was scarier. Where was Margaret if she was still alive? What would the point be if someone was copying her tracks? In the meantime, the abandoned cabin started getting visitors who weren't welcome. As the day went on, curious young people who liked the thrill of breaking the rules began climbing up there. They went through the things that were left behind and took small things as macabre trophies. Some people said they felt presences. There were strange cold drafts and whispers coming from the wooden walls inside the cabin. The sheriff had to put a sign on the door that said no one could come in, but it didn't help much. That's when something really scary was found during one of these surprise visits. A group of hunters found a secret room under the floorboards. Inside were dozens of handwritten diaries, page after page of them. The writing was shaky and crooked. Margaret is the owner of the diaries. That much was clear from the details about the person. Referred to, but the contents were unsettling. The notes talked about things that were seen in nature, the moon, and how animals behaved in the mountains. There were very detailed pictures of plants, roots, and fungi, and even botanists in the area couldn't figure out what some of them were. There were, however, parts of these scientific notes that made no sense at all. Phrases in languages I didn't know, and complicated pictures that looked like maps but had nothing to do with geography. That wasn't all. There were also references to meetings with. There were people whose names were not in the county records. Margaret wrote about getting together with other people who were looking for the same secrets at night in certain mountain spots and sharing what they knew. But when the police checked the names given, they found that none of them were associated with known people who lived in the area. They were like ghosts on paper, names that may not have existed or belonged to a different time that got lost in the mists of Appalachian oral history. Officer Oakes took the diaries with him and started a more in-depth investigation. He noticed that the last entries, which were made weeks before Margaret went missing, had a different tone. They were very important and almost desperate. She wrote that she thought someone was watching her and that something was changing in the mountains. She talked about seeing signs that she wasn't the only one doing what she was doing, that other people had found the same path she was on. Margaret wrote something very scary in her last journal entry, which was written just 3 days before she went missing. The woman said she had decided to leave early because it was getting late. She told them about a certain mountain cave in the mountains that only a few people knew about, and where she planned to do one last ritual. Her words made it sound like she would not be the same person after that. She might also stop being a person altogether. What was written in the diaries completely changed the way the investigation was going. Sheriff Oakes called together a group of experienced trackers to find the cave, talked about in Margaret's writings. Even though the description wasn't very clear, some older men in the area knew what it meant. In the Appalachian mountain range, there were many old caves that were only known to hunters who had spent generations exploring the area. The trip began in the morning of a June morning, when the sun finally broke through the thick trees. They went along paths that hadn't been used in decades, paths that time itself seemed to have forgotten. The mountains were different and wilder, like people had never really reached that point in time. The plants grew in a disorganized way, with tangled patterns that made it hard to get through. It took them 2 days to find the mouth of the cave. Behind a curtain of ivy and moss, it was so well hidden that they would have missed it if one of the trackers hadn't seen small marks on the rocks nearby. These were the same signs that were carved into the trees near Margaret's cabin, and with enough accuracy to show that they were made with the right tools and plenty of time. The men had to stoop to get through the narrow entrance. The cave door opened into a large room with a ceiling high enough for them to stand up straight. With the torch's light, the walls were covered with hundreds of more symbols that were arranged in patterns that repeated in complicated ways. A perfect circle was drawn on the stone floor in the middle of the room, and inside this circle were arranged things that Margaret had clearly left behind. There were burned-out candles with pools of solidified wax, glass jars with substances that had dried out over time, pieces of fabric tied into specific shapes, and a pile of ashes that looked like it had been a bonfire in the middle of it all. The sheriff carefully looked at everything and made detailed notes. There weren't any signs of fights or violence. It just looked like something important had been done. What interested Everyone was most interested in what was found in a natural crack in the cave wall. More books and papers were stacked on top of them, out of the way of the rain because they were higher up and drier. They weren't the same as the diaries that were in the cabin. The pages looked old because they were yellowed from age, and Margaret's handwriting wasn't on them. The texts were copies or transcriptions of something even older that had been passed down through generations. The papers talked about habits that went back to the first. When European settlers came to the Appalachians, they brought with them traditions that may have been even older, passed down from the people who lived in these mountains before the settlers came. It was a strange mix of things that were known about nature, about cycles and changes, and about how to connect with something the text just called the presence of the mountains. All of that stuff was taken back to town by sheriff folks. Scholars from nearby universities and people who knew about local history helped him. And stories. Opinions were very different. Some people thought Margaret had found old practices and was writing them down for academic reasons. Some people said she was too involved with old traditions that shouldn't be brought back. But none of these explanations got to the bottom of the mystery. In what place was Margaret Ward? Should she have done her ritual in the cave and then left? Where did she go? And the sightings that different people said they saw in the mountains, were they really her, or just made up by the collective imagination fueled by worry and fear? During the summer of 1902, more sightings took place. Someone saw a woman who looked like Margaret in Pine Mountain, which is a long way from where she used to live. Another report came in from Black Mountain, which is close to the border with Virginia. It was always the same story. A single figure watched from a distance and then vanished before anyone could get in touch. It felt like she was walking across the whole Appalachians for some reason that only she knew about. What made these stories true? What was most upsetting was how consistent the details were. People who said they had seen Margaret always said she had the same stare into the distance and stood still, as if she wasn't fully human. Some people said she looked like she was looking for something because she was staring off into the distance as if she were waiting for someone to arrive that she had been waiting for a long time. People in Harlan County started to get used to the new situation slowly. Eventually, everyone broke into Margaret's cabin and took everything valuable or interesting. Only the wooden walls and roof, which was sagging from the ages, were still there. At night, people still didn't want to walk by, but during the day, things went back to normal. But Sheriff Oakes couldn't just let the case go. He kept looking into each new report, going to faraway places every time a new clue came up. It took him a whole drawer to store all of his files on Margaret Ward. Maps with the sightings marked on them, copies of symbols found in trees and caves, and transcripts of diaries, and everything else was carefully set up so that a pattern could appear. On an autumn afternoon, almost a year after the person first went missing, the sheriff finally found something important. He put all the maps on his desk and marked each place where Margaret was said to have been seen. Looking at the points, he saw that they made a clear but not straight line. Following the Appalachian mountain range north toward the mountains of Virginia, she was moving in a certain direction. Besides, this new information brought up new questions. Was Margaret trying to get away from something or find something? The old writings that were found in the cave talked about other places in the mountains that were powerful and where certain rituals could be performed. Could she have been following a map that only people who had studied the same tricky information could see? The sheriff chose to go one more time. He went north through the mountains on the path that the sightings showed him. It had been a long trip, going through remote communities where people still lived the way their ancestors did many generations ago. He asked about Margaret everywhere, bringing the sketch he had had made based on the descriptions, and he always got the same answer. She had been through that place, but no one had been able to talk to her. Sheriff Oakes's journey took him to places where few police officers were afraid to go. Even more remote than Kentucky's mountains, Virginia's had deep valleys where whole towns could live. Kept in touch with other people for months at a time. The people there were shy and wary of strangers, especially those who asked them questions about things they wanted to keep private. A person who was willing to talk was found in the small village of Dongan, which is near the Clinch River. It was an old man who worked as a blacksmith and was always in touch with travelers coming from all directions. He said that he had seen a woman who fit the description, but he added something that no one else had before. He said Margaret wasn't by herself when she went by. It was said by the blacksmith that Margaret was talking to someone else near an old wooden bridge that crossed the river. From far away, it was hard to tell what it was, but it looked like someone was waiting for her there. They stayed together for a short time and traded what looked like things before going their separate ways. Margaret kept going north, and the other person disappeared into the forest to the west. This new information changed everything. Margaret wasn't just wandering through the mountains without a plan. She was getting to know other people, maybe others who practiced the same rituals and knew the same things she did. This made me think there was a network, a group of people spread out across the Appalachians who shared beliefs and did things that no one else knew about. Sheriff Oakes worked hard for weeks to learn more about this supposedly criminal group. It was pastors, merchants, and forest rangers that he talked to. Anyone who may have seen animals moving in strange ways in the mountains. What he found was only pieces, but they put together to make a disturbing picture. There were always stories told in a low, hesitant voice about people who lived in the most remote parts of the Appalachians and had turned their backs on society completely. These people weren't just loner hermits looking for peace and quiet. Reports say that they lived in small, secret communities and got together on certain dates each year to perform ceremonies that no one from the outside ever saw. They stayed in touch by leaving posts on trails and carving symbols into trees that showed them the way and sent messages. In the shadows of the real world, there was a parallel world that no one could see unless they knew where to look. The sheriff started to understand that Margaret had gotten into this secret world. The signs she left behind were more than just magical decorations. They were messages for people who could understand that silent language. Every mark on a tree, each object, when placed in a certain way, was a part of a conversation that happened over the mountains, through counties and states. But no words were spoken. When I realized this, I felt like I had no control. How could he look into something that didn't work in the usual ways that people do things? How could he find someone who had chosen to hide in a maze of forests and caves, watched over by a group of people who were also invisible? The sheriff thought that Margaret Ward might not have wanted to be found in the first place. Her disappearance wasn't a tragedy that needed to be solved. It was a choice. Sheriff Oakes went back to Harlan County in late 1902. The case was officially filed as an unsolved missing person, but he wrote something different in his own records. He said in writing that he thought Margaret Ward had found what she was looking for, that she had crossed an invisible line and was now in a place between the real world and something older, deeper, and more rooted in the mountains. Over the next few years, the number of sightings slowly went down. Margaret was seen less and less until there were almost no reports of her. For sure, the last report came from a hunter in the Great Smoky Mountains, which are on the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, in 1904. He talked about how he found a woman camping near a waterfall that was far away. It was clear that she had been there for a long time. When he got close, she just looked at him with that blank, distant look on her face and then started getting her things together and went off into the woods. After that, there was silence. There was a story about Margaret Ward in the Appalachian Mountains. Stories about her were told from one generation to the next, with each person adding their own details and ideas. Some people said she had found a way to live in the mountains forever and had become a part of the scenery. Others thought she had just died in the woods, far away from anyone else, and her body had been eaten by the trees. Over the next 10 years, the cabin where she had lived fell apart completely. The cave where she had. Did her last known ritual, which was slowly forgotten. Its location was lost when the trackers who knew where she was died without telling anyone else. Sheriff Oak's diaries and other papers were kept in the county office for many years until a fire in 1923 destroyed many of the historical records. The stories, which are bits of memory kept alive through oral tradition, were all that were left. Margaret had carved pictures into trees that stayed there for years, or even decades, before bark grew over them or the trees died. Died on its own. People would still find one of these old marks every once in a while and wonder what it meant. Margaret Ward had been looking for something in the Appalachians that normal society couldn't give her. She didn't know that she was part of a silent conversation that had been going on in the mountains at the start of the century. No one will ever know if she found what she was looking for or not. What's left is the echo of her passing, a shadow that still lives there. The stories that people tell each other about the mysteries that their mountains hold on cold nights when they get together. The Appalachians went through a lot of changes over the next few decades. The railroads went through areas that had not been touched before. Logging companies started to use old forests for their timber, and small remote communities slowly became connected to the rest of the world. The Kentucky that Margaret Ward knew was going away, and being replaced by a version of itself that was easier to get to and less mysterious. Mountain ranges, on the other hand, are. Remember, there were new reports coming out in the 1920s when a new generation was already living in Harlan County. They were no longer specifically about Margaret. Instead, they were about strange things happening in the same places where she had been last seen. Hikers said they found empty campsites in very remote areas with campfires that had just been put out and no one there to claim them. Hunters said they felt uncanny things in some mountain areas, like someone was watching them and making their hair stand on end. Stand up straight. It wasn't worry about the weather or being afraid of wild animals. Being aware that the space wasn't as empty as it seemed was something else. Some people avoided these areas completely, taking longer routes that went around them just to avoid going through them. In 1928, a certain event made people interested in Margaret Ward's story again. A group of railroad workers who were cutting a path through the mountains for a new line found another cave. This one was. It was deeper and had more chambers connected by narrow passages than the one that was found years before. Inside, they found signs that people had been there recently, but no one could explain how. The walls had marks on them that the workers knew were similar to the ones that old residents still used to talk about when they told stories about the woman who had gone missing in the mountains. They weren't just old signs, though. Some looked brand new, like they were engraved just a few weeks or months ago. Also, there were things that were left behind, like simple tools, food that had been preserved, and clothes made from natural materials. The most scary thing was a set of drawings that were found in one of the deepest rooms. At least it looked like they were maps. They marked specific spots along hundreds of kilometers of the Appalachian mountain range, which was very clear. There were notes next to each mark in a script that mixed English with symbols that I couldn't understand. The workers gave these maps to the people in charge in their area, hoping for some kind of explanation. A historian from the University of Kentucky looked at the papers and found them interesting. He said that the maps showed a network of caves, springs, and certain rock formations spread out across the Appalachian Mountains. Some of these places were known, but a lot of them were not in any official records. It looked like a secret guide that was passed down among people who didn't follow any normal social rules. This made me think of some tough questions. Margaret Ward was no longer there, a long time ago. Could she still be alive? Could she stay in the mountains and roam with other people who had chosen the same path? The idea didn't make sense, but the maps were new. Someone was keeping that information up to date and adding new places to the network to keep it alive. The historian suggested going on an expedition to check out some of the places shown on the maps. He put together a small group of experienced trackers and a photographer to write down what they found. This is what they did when they left in May 1929. The strange maps. Over the next few weeks, they found things that were both interesting and scary. Some of the marked spots turned out to be caves that no one had ever heard of before. Some of them had unusual geological features, like springs with very clean water and rock formations that made strange sounds and echoes. They chose these places on purpose because each one offered something different, like safety, resources, or complete solitude. In each one, they found evidence of recent use. These weren't long-term camps, they were just stopping points, places where someone had slept, cooked, and maybe even spent a night or two before moving on. The group realized they were following a path that was normally used by people moving through the mountains, but that no one else could see. It was like finding a ghost road that works perfectly, but no one else knows about. One thing that happened on the expedition was something that no one would ever forget. They set up camp near one of the caves shown on the map, in the Smoky Mountains. The valley below was lit up by the full moon on a clear night. When the photographer woke up around midnight, he saw a light moving far away and going down a path that was hard to see during the day. He told the others, and they all just stood there and watched. As it got closer, the light turned out to be a lantern being carried by someone. The figure walked sure of itself, even though it was dark, following the path like it was nothing. They could see it when it got close enough. I could tell it was a woman with a backpack on her back. She was wearing simple clothes. In the direction of the camp, she didn't look. Instead, she kept walking until she disappeared into the forest. They were all afraid to call out or follow. There was something about the scene that made them think they shouldn't get involved, that what they were seeing didn't matter to them. They looked for footprints the next morning and found a clear path. They followed it for a few hundred meters until it went into a stream and was gone. There were no exit marks on the other side. It looked like the person had gone into the water and disappeared. When they got back, the expedition had more questions than answers. The historian wrote up a detailed report of what he found, but it was never made public. He put the paper in his own collection and only made a note of it. There are some mountain secrets that should stay hidden. The maps that were found in the cave were put back where they were found, which was a strange choice. There were many, but the historian insisted on the right one. Everyone in the country had a hard time in the 1930s. During the Great Depression, a lot of people had to leave their homes to find work and better opportunities in faraway places. It's funny, but this also sent some people in the opposite direction. Men and women who were unhappy with modern society started to go to the more remote parts of Appalachia to find safety. These new mountain dwellers sometimes got lost as they tried to get away from the economic collapse that was hurting the cities. Upon proof that people had lived there for a much longer time, well-kept trails in areas that are said to be unexplored. There were cabins that were so well hidden that only people who knew where to look could find them. People grew gardens in hidden clearings that were a long way from any road or settlement. It was clear that there was a whole population hiding in the shadows on purpose. Robert Caldwell was one of these new people who moved into the mountains. He had lost everything He chose to live in the forests of Tennessee instead of begging on the streets of Nashville after the stock market crash. Robert built a simple cabin close to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He hunted, fished, and grew some small crops to make a living. During this time, he met the mysterious people who lived in the mountains for the first time. In letters to a friend, Robert wrote about how he found food left near his hut more than once. They weren't valuable gifts, they were just herbs and dried food, and easy tools. Someone left them there, but he never saw them. He thought it was a way to talk to them. He was being watched and judged, and it looked like someone thought he should get some help. In response, he started leaving his own gifts, cut down trees for firewood, prepared animal hides, and salt that he got on his few trips to civilization. This exchange went on in silence for months, until Robert finally saw someone one winter night. He was up late keeping the fire going because it was so cold when he heard it. Sounds outside. He saw a figure coming toward the pile, where he usually left his offerings, through the window. It looked like a woman of unknown age who was dressed in layers of natural materials. She looked at what Robert had left, gave a silent nod of approval, and put a small package down before disappearing into the darkness. Robert didn't look at what was left until morning. There were seeds of plants he didn't know in a small leather pouch, along with handwritten instructions on how to grow them. There were clear instructions on what kind of soil to use, how much sunlight to get, when to plant, and when to harvest. Robert did what it said to do, and the plants did really well. They gave him healthy vegetables that helped him get through the hardest months. Other people who lived on the edges of civilization started to report this kind of interaction. In the mountains, there was a secret community of people who had given up on the modern world completely. They went through as if they were ghosts. The people who lived in the forest kept their own traditions and knowledge, and sometimes interacted with outsiders who respected nature and old ways of life. In 1935, Robert finally had a full conversation with one of these people who lived in secret. An older man came to his cabin during a very bad storm and asked to stay there. Robert immediately made him feel welcome by offering him food and a spot by the fire. They talked about a lot of different things while the rain hit the roof at night. The man never told them his name and told them stories about living in the mountains. He said there were at least a dozen or even hundreds of people living this way all over the Appalachian mountain range. They didn't live together as a single community. Instead, they were made up of scattered individuals and small groups who shared beliefs and ways of life. They stayed in touch through signals and occasional meetings, sharing information about plants that could heal, safe places to camp, and reliable water sources. The man said that this way of life went back a very long time, maybe even before Europeans came and settled in North America. Traditions from different places had been mixed together to make something that was only found in the mountains. Robert asked about Margaret Ward, hoping that the name would bring back memories. The man just smiled and said that many people had chosen this path over the years, each for their own reasons. The man warned Robert before he left the next morning. The mountains were getting different. The government built roads, added to national parks, and brought tourists to places that used to be wild. The way of life he and others had been living for a long time was getting harder and harder. In a few decades, it might not be possible to live freely and without being seen. Everyone who lived that way knew it was the end of an era. Robert stayed in the mountains until 1940, when the war made him come back to the city. He buried the letters he had written before he left, written about what happened near his cabin, and put a stone there to mark the spot. After many years, when he was old and sick, he told his grandson about that place to hide. In 1978, the grandson found the letters in a metal box that had stood the test of time. One of the few direct records about the hidden Appalachian community was these letters. Historians who studied them were fascinated by the stories of a society that existed in the background of modern America. Some people tried to find physical. They looked for signs of these communities but only found pieces. There were broken-down huts in remote areas, gardens that had been left to grow wild, and carvings on trees that no one else could figure out. Margaret Ward's story was woven into this bigger picture. She wasn't a one-off. She was part of something bigger and longer lasting. A lot of people agreed with her choice to disappear into the mountains. Each one was looking for something that normal society couldn't give them. Freedom for all. Getting away from the stresses and expectations of modern life. Spending time in nature, or maybe something deeper and harder to describe. The Appalachians changed for good in the years after World War II. When veterans came home, they brought new experiences from their time abroad. Paved roads were built to connect villages that were once cut off from each other, and areas that had only used lamps for light now had electricity. The old way of life in the mountains was quickly dying out and being replaced by a more modern way of life, and linked version of rural America in the United States. There were a lot fewer reports of strange things happening in the mountains during this time of change. Every year, thousands of tourists explored national parks, making areas that were once really remote smaller. Maps were made of dense forests, caves were listed, and remote valleys were given official names and exact coordinates. Mountain secrets seemed to have been lost for good. But something happened in 1956 that made the ancient. There were still some mysteries left to solve. Geologists doing work for the U.S. Geological Survey found a network of caves deep in the Great Smoky Mountains that are all connected to each other. The system was much bigger than any that had been known before. Tunnels went for kilometers below the ground. Geologists found clear signs of human habitation during the first exploration. These weren't old artifacts from people who lived before Columbus. They were signs of more recent events. Job title. There were places where fires had been lit over and over, leaving layers of ash. Niches in the walls where food had been stored, and even a simple system for collecting water from the cave's natural leaks. Some of this evidence looked like it was only a few years old, which made it even more interesting. There was still some wood left over from the fires. The colors and textures of fabrics found in one of the deepest holes were still there. That space below had been used by someone. As a safe place to stay, maybe even as a permanent home, when the world on the surface was fully mapped out and modernized. Geologists told people what they had found, but not many people were interested in doing more research. The main focus was on the scientific side of the caves, like how they were formed geologically and how the water systems worked underground. People thought that the possibility of living there was just a small curiosity. They thought that it was probably an oddball hermit who had found a temporary hiding place, not really anyone. Thought about the idea that it might have been a part of something bigger, but forest rangers in the area started to see patterns that didn't make sense. Sometimes they found trails that had just been used in places that shouldn't have had anyone else there. Footprints in fresh mud near springs that are far away, and ashes from campfires in places where camping wasn't allowed. When they tried to follow these clues, they always came to places where the tracks just disappeared for no apparent reason. One of these woods. One of the rangers, Thomas Brenner, became very interested in these mysteries. He started writing down every strange thing he saw and making his own maps to mark the spots where strange things were happening. He saw that there was a pattern over time. People always went to certain places more often at certain times of the year, usually when the seasons were changing and there weren't as many tourists on the trails. Thomas chose one of these places to set up a secret watch. On the autumnal equinox of 1959, he picked a high point with a good view of a clearing that looked like it was used often. He only saw wild animals going about their normal lives for 3 nights. But on the 4th night, just before dawn, people came out of the forest. It was just the 2 women and 1 man, and they were all carrying backpacks. They moved in the quiet way of people who live their whole lives in the woods, planning each step so as not to make any noise. In the open space, They put their backpacks down and started getting something ready. Something important was going on, not a meal. While sitting around the small fire, they talked in too low of a voice for Thomas to hear. The forest ranger kept an eye on them for almost an hour. There was some kind of ritual going on between the three people, but it didn't look dangerous or scary. It was almost meditative, a quiet link between them and the world around them. When the sun came up, they carefully put out the campfire, gathered their things, and each one went in a different direction back into the forest. Thomas didn't try to follow them or let them know he was there. For some reason, the scene made him feel like he was seeing something holy that shouldn't be broken up. After they left, he went down to the clearing and looked at the scene. The only thing that was there was the ash from the campfire arranged in a perfect circle. One of the stones was also carved into the bark of a nearby tree. Things that people used to associate with Margaret Ward many years ago. This discovery brought together pieces that had been split up for years. In the second half of the 20th century, the hidden mountain community was still around. They had changed and become even more careful, but they kept doing the things they had always done. Margaret Ward was just one of many people who chose this path. It looks like new people are still making the choice today. Thomas Brenner never officially told anyone what he saw. He kept working as a forest ranger, but he had a new view of what his job was. The goal wasn't just to keep people out of the forest. It was also to keep the secrets that the forest held safe. When he sometimes found proof of that hidden presence, he just wrote it down in his personal records and kept quiet. Over the next few years, Thomas had a few more short encounters with people who lived in the mountains. They never had long conversations, just looked at each other and nodded to show that they knew each other. They knew that he knew and that he wouldn't get in the way. They lived in the same space, but had completely different realities. They had an unspoken agreement to live together in peace. Thomas quit his job with the Forest Service in 1965. He put all of his personal information about the hidden people in a sealed box before he left, telling them that it should not be opened until 50 years after he died. He died in 1982, and the box was kept in a family archive until 2032, when it was finally opened. It had decades' worth of careful observations about a community that had stayed hidden even as the rest of the world became completely modernized. People became interested in the Appalachians again in the 1970s and 1980s, but for different reasons. The movement for the environment grew stronger. Conservation groups started to fight to protect the last wild areas, and a whole generation of young people wanted to get back in touch with nature. Strangely, their search for authenticity and simplicity led them closer to the same trails that the mountain people who lived in secret had been using for generations. During this time, reports of encounters that seemed to follow a pattern started to come out. Backpackers who were hiking the Appalachian Trail said they saw lone figures in remote areas. These figures were clearly not tourists. These people carried very little gear, moved quickly, and were completely sure of themselves as they went through the rough terrain. Went away when they knew someone was watching them. In 1977, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell had an amazing experience while hiking the whole trail from south to north. She went off the main path to explore a mountain area that not many people visit, and that's where she got lost. As is common in the Appalachians, the fog had moved in quickly, leaving Sarah completely lost and unable to find her way back to the main trail. As fear set in, Sarah saw very faint marks on some trees. They were not the official trail markers, they were something else. Small lines that looked like they were connected were carved into the bark. She decided to follow these marks because it felt right. They led her through the forest on a path that wound around and down until she came out near a stream she knew. Someone left a small pile of dry firewood and a package wrapped in plant-based material next to the stream. Sarah took the package out and found dried. There was food, herbs that looked like they could help with health problems, and a small hand-drawn map that showed how to get back to the main trail. There was no note or explanation. There was only the quiet support of someone who knew how hard things were for her. Sarah used the map to find her way back to safety. When she told her story to other hikers who had done it before, they weren't surprised. It sounds like people who spent a lot of time in the mountains heard similar stories. There was a presence of safety in the forests. There were people who watched without being seen and sometimes stepped in to help when someone was really in danger. There were never any clear or direct interventions. No one would suddenly show up and save someone. Instead, it was always small markings that showed up just when they were needed, like supplies left in key spots or small signs that helped people who got lost find their way back to safety. As if the people who lived in the mountains in secret kept a constant watch over them, keeping themselves and those who came to visit safe. In the 1980s, an anthropologist from Appalachian State University chose to look into these stories in a planned way. As a child, Dr. Marcus Webb lived in the mountains and knew stories about hidden communities. He thought that the stories might be true, but maybe not in the supernatural way that some people thought, but as a real subculture that had stayed out of the public eye. Webb spent years gathering information by talking to retired forest rangers and people who had lived in the mountain areas for a long time. What he put together was very interesting. Over the course of several decades, there were hundreds of stories with similar themes. Seeing people in strange places, finding well-kept campsites that had been abandoned, and strange events that helped travelers in trouble. Webb was most interested in how the symbols talked about in different accounts were always the same. The markings showed up in stories that were decades and hundreds of kilometers apart. This made it seem like the hidden community was not only real, but it kept up a standard way of talking to each other, a visual language that had been passed down from generation to generation. Webb tried to find some of these symbols on his own. He spent months walking along remote trails, looking at old trees, and looking for caves that were mentioned in old writings. He found some of the marks, took close-up pictures of them, and tried to figure out what they meant. What he found was that many of them were waypoints that led to water sources, safe places to camp, or places to stay away from. In 1987, Webb had his own encounter while on one of his trips. He was camping in the Great Smoky Mountains in a remote area when he woke up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was watching him. Through the hole in his tent, he could see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. The moon was the only light on the figure. It was too dark to see specifics, but the person's posture made it look like they were at ease in the forest. Webb didn't move, and his anthropological. In training, they told him not to move quickly. The figure stood there and looked for about 2 minutes. After making a movement that was hard to notice, it put something on the ground and then vanished into the darkness without making a sound. Webb didn't look into it until morning. There was a charcoal drawing on a small piece of tree bark that was the same one he had been taking pictures of and trying to figure out. It was clear that the simple symbol was meant to be there. Webb thought it was a message, a way to let him know they saw him, and maybe even a gentle warning. People put up with him, but there were limits he shouldn't cross. There was talk between worlds, and the hidden community made it clear that they knew about his investigations. They also set boundaries that were invisible but real. Webb changed how he did things after this happened. Instead of actively trying to find or write down the hidden residents, he focused on keeping the stories alive and protecting the places where they lived. Them. He said that some things should stay unknown, and that not all things should be categorized and explained. His academic peers didn't agree with his point of view, but he stood firm. Webb wrote only one article about his research, and even that one was purposely vague. Using the Appalachians as an example, he talked about the idea that there might be marginalized groups living on the edges of modern society. Neither did he name specific places, nor include the pictures he had taken of the signs. He decided not to reveal the information he had gathered about people who chose to stay hidden, so it stayed safe. There didn't seem to be any kind of truly hidden life after the turn of the 21st century. Every part of the Earth's surface was mapped by satellites. Anyone could find out exactly where they were thanks to GPS systems, and trail cameras caught people moving in areas that were thought to be empty. Like the rest of the world, the Appalachians were always changing, being watched, recorded, and monitored. Still, the mysteries kept coming back. Biologists put up automatic cameras in different parts of the Great Smoky Mountains in 2003 to study black bear populations. Motion detectors turned on the cameras and took pictures of anything that moved in front of them. Over the course of 6 months, they took thousands of pictures of animals, such as bears, deer, coyotes, and even some rare animals that weren't often talked about. But among all these images that were expected, there were some that the researchers had no idea how to figure out. Pictures of people walking along unmarked trails, always by themselves and always at dusk or dawn. The pictures were good enough to be sure they were real people, and not just tricks of light and shadow, but the faces were never very clear. The people seemed to know exactly where the cameras were and kept their heads down or turned at the exact moment they were caught. Biologists were most interested in the fact that these people weren't carrying modern camping gear, tools, and equipment. There were no bright nylon backpacks, LED flashlights, or technical clothes that would keep you dry. The clothes they wore looked like they were made from simple fabrics, leather that had been worked, and woven baskets. As if they were from a different time, they walked through a century that wasn't really theirs. Biologists tried to follow these figures by using timestamps from photos to figure out how they moved. They found that the same areas were being traveled over and over, but at different times each time. That didn't seem to follow a calendar. There would be weeks at a time when nothing was seen. At other times, there were several captures in a row. No pattern could be seen, or at least none that made sense to people from the outside. Some of the biologists, like Diana Hartwell, became very interested in these strange pictures. She began to learn them when she had some free time. Diana looked at the background, zoomed in on details, and tried to figure out exactly where each picture had been taken. Realized that the places were linked in a way that linked drinking water sources, well-known caves, and open areas that got a lot of sun. It was like an invisible map of things you needed to stay alive. Diana chose to spend more time in the field, not just setting up cameras, but also watching things for herself. She picked strategic spots based on the patterns she had found, and then just waited, sometimes in silence for days at a time. On a foggy October morning in 2004, she finally saw someone at one of these vigils. Person. The figure came out of the fog as if it were a part of it. It moved so quietly that Diana didn't even notice it until it was just a few meters away. It was hard to tell how old the woman was because her long hair was neatly pulled back, and her clothes looked like they were sewn by hand. From far away, Diana couldn't tell what was in the wicker basket she was carrying. Diana didn't move at all and barely managed to breathe. The woman took a short break and looked straight ahead. She smiled as she hid behind a group of trees. It wasn't an angry smile, it was a smile of recognition. She knew she was being watched, but she didn't seem to mind. Maybe she was even looking forward to it. The woman then kept going on her way and disappeared into the trees in the same quiet, fluid way she had come. Diana changed because of this short meeting. She realized that there were levels of life in the mountains that science today couldn't fully understand. Not because there wasn't enough. Not because of a lack of technology or method, but because some things could only be understood by doing them yourself. treating each other with respect, and realizing that not everything needs to be set down or explained. Diana kept studying bears, but she stopped trying to record or track the people who showed up on the cameras. When her coworkers asked her about the strange pictures, she just said that they were probably of hikers who knew the area well. In a way, it wasn't a lie, it was just part of the truth. She had chosen to. She wanted to keep what she had found safe, even though she didn't fully understand what it was. Over the next few years, the mountains got more high-tech. Drones started flying over remote areas and making centimeter-accurate maps of the land. Hikers could share where they were in real time using mobile apps. There were geotagged pictures of every part of the national parks all over social networks. It looked like the time of secrets was over for good, and there was no longer any truly uncharted or unknown territory. But people who spent real, forest rangers, field researchers, and people who lived in the mountains full-time, not just weekend visitors, knew otherwise. They kept finding signs of something that wouldn't let them see it all. There were trails that showed up on satellite maps but were gone when you tried to follow them on the ground. There were structures that could be seen from some angles but blended in with the scenery from others. It looked like the mountains were working together to keep some things secret. In 2011, a certain event led to more thought should be put into these mysteries. 12 college students were on an environmental studies trip when Michael Torres, one of them, got lost and couldn't find his friends. They were moving on while he was taking pictures of an interesting lichen pattern on some rocks. He was lost and alone when he finally looked up. Michael tried to get back by going in what he thought was the right direction, but he quickly realized he was lost. In the middle of the forest, cell phones often didn't work, and the sun was starting to go down. He was getting scared when he heard a sound. It wasn't an animal, but it also wasn't a person. It was a melodic call that kept happening at regular times. Michael followed the sound more out of desperation than choice. He finally got to a small clearing where he found something he didn't expect. There was a building there that wasn't quite a hut, but wasn't just a makeshift shelter either. It was somewhere in the middle. It was made of branches that were tangled together and covered in leaves and moss. It looked so much like the rest of the forest that you could walk right up to it and not even notice. A small campfire was close to the building, and someone was sitting next to it. Even though Michael couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman because it was so dark, the figure made a clear motion for him to come closer. Michael wasn't sure. He was reminded of all the times he shouldn't trust strangers, but the other option was to spend the night in the forest by yourself, without a place to stay or food. He moved slowly toward her. The figure didn't say anything. All it did was point to a log next to the campfire where Michael could sit. As night fell, they stayed there in silence for the next few hours. The figure fed the fire every so often, which kept it small but steady. It gave Michael something that looked like herbal tea at one point, served in a hollow wooden cup. Michael drank, and right away he felt calm. It wasn't just the warmth of the drink. It was something deeper. He felt like his stress was melting away. He started to feel sleepy and calm down, even though he was in a very strange situation. The figure made another move that meant it was safe to sleep, and Michael, pleasantly surprised by his confidence, agreed. He was by himself when he woke up the next morning. The campfire had been carefully put out, and the building he had seen the night before looked different and more interesting in the light. Natural and less obviously man-made. Michael wondered for a moment if it had really happened, or if it was just a dream he was having because he was scared and tired. But then he saw something next to him, a small package covered in big leaves. There were dry foods, a small water bottle, and what looked like a map inside the package. The picture wasn't made on paper, but on a thin piece of tree bark with what looked like charcoal. The map was surprisingly detailed, showing the area around the house, terrain and making it clear how to get back to the main trail, where his group was probably still looking for him. After following the map for a few hours, Michael found his friends. They were scared and ready to call for help. Michael realized it didn't make sense when he tried to explain what had happened. A strange building, a quiet person, a tea that made him feel better right away, and a map drawn on tree bark. He chose to keep the story simple by only saying that he had found shelter and figured out where he was. The next morning, Michael kept the bark map, though. He carefully kept it for years, and when he was getting his master's degree in anthropology, he decided to look into it more. He went back to the Great Smoky Mountains, to the exact spot where he got lost, and tried to find that clearing once more. It took him days of searching, but he never found it exactly. There were other clearings like this one, but none had the structure he remembered so clearly. The things Michael found during this search was that other people had similar stories too. He heard dozens of similar stories from forest rangers and people who lived in the area, people who got lost and were helped by unknown people, hikers who found shelter in buildings that they later lost their way, people who got silent help from someone who then disappeared without leaving any normal signs. Some parts of all of these stories were the same. There was always help when it was really needed. Never before. The people helpers never spoke. They only used signs and gestures to talk to each other. Someone always left something behind, like a map, food, or just marks that led the person back to safety. In the shadows of the mountains, there was an invisible defense system that was run by people who had chosen to live completely separate from modern society. Here we are, at the end of our trip through the mysterious and dark Appalachian Mountains. The story of Margaret Ward began. In 1901, when she went missing without a trace, never really ended. It grew into a bigger story that spanned more than 100 years and linked a huge number of people who went down similar paths looking for something that the normal world couldn't give them. The Appalachians are still one of the last places on Earth where you can truly disappear. Even though technology has grown by leaps and bounds, and the world's truly wild areas have shrunk dramatically in recent years. Not because their mountains are the tallest, not because they have the most dense forests, or the most history, tradition, or knowledge that can't be captured by satellites or written down on digital maps. Even now, stories are still coming out. A woman named Rebecca Santos was hiking alone in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park in 2018 when she had an experience that would change her whole view of what is possible in the modern world. Rebecca was a tech executive from Washington, D.C., who was used to being constantly connected and always with. She has a lot of devices with her all the time. Rebecca decided to turn off all of her electronics while she was walking because she wanted to be truly disconnected for a few hours. It was when technology was not moving that she noticed something that she normally wouldn't have. There were very small marks on some trees that looked natural at first glance, but when you looked more closely, you could see that they were clearly made on purpose. Rebecca was interested, so she started to follow these marks, which led her off the main trail. They took her on a winding path through the forest that stayed at the same height until she reached a spot from which she could see a whole valley below. She saw something that shouldn't have been there in the distance. There was smoke coming from a lot of different places, in thin columns that disappeared quickly in the wind but could only have come from human campfires. She looked at what she saw for a long time, trying to figure it out. These were not camps for tourists. They were spread out too much and in too many places. Incredibly hard to get to with modern tools. These weren't things that forest rangers did. She had a good idea of where the official stations were. There was something else there, proof that people lived in places where no one was officially living there. Rebecca had a strong sense that someone was watching her back as she watched. The feeling was clear, even though no one could be seen around her. It was as if the mountains themselves knew she was there, looking at her. With good intentions, she chose not to try to go down into the valley and look into it more. Something told her that there were invisible lines she shouldn't cross, and that some spaces were only for people who had chosen to be there. After going back to the main trail, Rebecca eventually went back to her life in Washington. The event, however, stuck with her. She started to look into historical records, old stories, and anything else that might help her understand what she had seen. That's how she found Margaret. Ward's stories, the sightings over the years, and the quiet meetings in the mountains were all woven together into a bigger tapestry than she had imagined. Rebecca realized that there have always been and will always be people who choose to live outside of what society considers normal. This may be the most important truth of the whole story. This option is available in Appalachia, but not in many other places. The mountains offer not only space, but also a history of acceptance and a lot of experience. How to live without being seen has been passed down from generation to generation. It wasn't the first time someone did this, and it won't be the last. She was part of a lineage that probably went back to before the Utes came to these lands. The first people who lived there knew about deep caves, hidden springs, and valleys where time seemed to move more slowly. It was never lost what it knew. Basically, it changed hands many times over the years. There are a lot of ways to connect and use technology in the 21st century. There are still places in the Appalachians where people live this way. People who do it are more careful now because they know they need to stay hidden, but they are still there, following old traditions and living in harmony with natural cycles that most of us have forgotten. Hikers who are paying attention and know what to look for can still sometimes find the symbols that Margaret Ward carved into trees. She still lives in some of the caves she used to live in. Others are still secret, and only a few people know about them. People who are part of the network that can't be seen. People who know what they're doing and are going through the mountains with purpose still use the trails she used. They're not just used by weekend tourists. At the same time, knowing that there are other worlds going on behind our own is both very interesting and uncomfortable. That while most of us are busy with technology and rushing from one commitment to the next, there are others who live at a completely different pace and use the seasons and moon cycles to tell time, getting everything they need from the earth itself. We don't know how many people in Appalachia live this way right now. There might be a dozen, there might be 100. They don't fill out census forms, they're not taxed. There are no digital signs of them. They don't exist in the eyes of the government. They can't be ignored, though, by people who know where to look, read the signs, and respect the invisible lines. The story of Margaret Ward makes us think of something important. That there will always be mysteries in the world, no matter how hard we try to map, catalog, and control every part of it. Many people will always pick different paths and don't accept the structures we know and trust. And maybe, just maybe, that's something to be happy about instead of scared of. The Appalachians are full of mysteries that most likely will never be fully revealed. Each generation adds its own layers to the story, making it both unique and universal at the same time. The group, Margaret Ward, is just one name, but her story speaks to everyone because it's about something that affects all of us. The need to live by one's own rules, to find meaning in life, and to be in harmony with something bigger than ourselves. When the mist falls on the Appalachian valleys, shadows grow longer between old trees, and the only sound in the forest is the sound of water running far away. It's easy to imagine that someone is watching, and someone is moving quietly among the trees. The trees, living lives that the modern world can't see at all. That might be the way things should be, after all. We've come to the end of our journey with more questions than answers. In 1901, Margaret Ward went missing in the mountains of Kentucky. For decades afterward, she, or someone very much like her, was seen. The signs she left behind keep showing up. She still lives in the caves she used, and deep in the forests of the Appalachians, her story lives on, not in official records or papers, but in the mountains in your mind, and the people who chose to live there anyway. This story shows us that not everything needs to be explained, that there should be mysteries, and that there is value in not knowing the answer to some things. The Appalachians will keep telling their stories, and the people who live there will remain unknown. They will be safe from technology or force, but by choice, knowledge, and respect between those who know and those who don't. I'd rather not know. Now, we want you to think about this story. Tell us in the comments what you think about the idea that some people might live in a world that is not connected to modern society. If you liked this trip through the mysteries of Appalachia, you might want to subscribe to the channel to see more scary and interesting videos. Also, send this video to someone you know who likes mysteries that haven't been solved. Until next time, when we'll look into another story from the shadows of